13 nannies in 6 months. That was the standing record at the Sterling estate in Greenwich. Most fled in tears, 2 threatened aggressive lawsuits, and 1 simply left her designer luggage behind in her sheer desperation to escape the property. The Sterling twins, Beatrice and Leo, weren't just difficult children, they were systematically destructive, armed with black cards and a terrifying level of psychological manipulation. Their father, billionaire Richard Sterling, threw money at the problem until the problem became entirely unsolvable. No child care professional could handle them. It took a woman who had spent 6 years dealing with the absolute worst of humanity during the graveyard shift at a Manhattan diner to finally break the cycle. The Brass Spoon Diner on 54th Street was not the sort of establishment frequented by men wearing bespoke Brioni suits at 2 in the afternoon, but Clara Jenkins had stopped being surprised by the clientele years ago. At 26, Clara had the tired eyes of a woman carrying a mountain of debt and the sharp, unyielding posture of someone who didn't take disrespect from anyone. She had spent the last 6 years dodging thrown plates, de-escalating intoxicated Wall Street brokers, and cleaning up messes she didn't make, all to keep up with the crushing medical loans her late mother had left behind. She was wiping down booth 4 when the bell above the door chimed, admitting a wave of chaos. A tall man with sharp cheekbones and an exhausted, rigid jawline strode in. Clara immediately recognized him from the financial columns. Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Global Tech. But it wasn't the billionaire who caught Clara's attention. It was the cyclone of destruction trailing behind him. 2 7-year-olds, a boy and a girl with identical ice blue eyes and dark, tousled hair, were actively terrorizing a young woman in a tailored nanny's uniform. The woman Nanny number 13, though Clara didn't know it yet, was trembling, her face flushed with impending tears. "I won't sit there. It smells like poor people." "Beatrice," the little girl shrieked, kicking the base of a vinyl booth. "Beatrice, please," the nanny begged, her voice cracking. Before the nanny could reach her, Leo grabbed a heavy glass bottle of maple syrup from a nearby table. With the terrifyingly calm precision of a seasoned sociopath, he unscrewed the cap and inverted it directly over the nanny's open Louis Vuitton tote bag. Thick, amber liquid poured over an iPad, a leather wallet, and a silk scarf. "Leo, no!" The nanny burst into loud, jagged sobs, grabbing the ruined bag. "That's it! Mr. Sterling, I am done! I don't care about the non-disclosure agreement, and I don't care about the severance. They are monsters." Richard Sterling pinched the bridge of his nose, the picture of a man cornered by his own bloodline. "Miss Gable, please, let's just sit down and discuss." "I am calling an Uber," Miss Gable snapped, her professionalism completely shattered. She turned on her heel, her shoes sticking to the floor, and marched out of the diner, leaving a billionaire and 2 smug 7-year-olds standing in the aisle. Beatrice smirked, kicking her Mary Janes against the floor. That was too easy. "I give her a D-." Clara had seen enough. She didn't see a billionaire, and she certainly didn't see monsters. She saw 2 children throwing a tantrum in her section, and she saw a mess that she would inevitably have to clean up. She grabbed a damp rag and a plastic bus tub, marching over to the scene. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice cutting through the diner's low hum. It wasn't loud, but it possessed the unmistakable, razor-sharp authority of a woman who had broken up bar fights. Richard Sterling blinked, looking down at her in surprise. "I apologize for the disturbance. I'll pay for the damages." "You'll pay for the syrup," Clara interrupted, sliding the bus tub onto the table. She turned her gaze to Leo, who was already reaching for a bottle of ketchup. Clara didn't snatch the bottle away. Instead, she leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "If you pour that, you're going to be the one mopping it up, and our mop bucket smells like bleach and old onions. Your choice, kid." Leo froze. He was used to gasps, screaming, and pleading. He was not used to utter, unimpressed indifference. "You can't make me," he challenged, though his hand hesitated. "I can," Clara said flatly. "This is my section. In my section, we don't waste food, and we don't throw tantrums. Now, put the ketchup down, slide into the booth, and tell me if you want pancakes or waffles. I don't have all day." Beatrice crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. "Do you know who my father is?" "A man who looks like he desperately needs a black coffee," Clara replied without missing a beat. "Booth. Now." For a long, agonizing second, The twins stared at the waitress in her stained pink apron. Clara stared back, unblinking, her posture relaxed but unyielding. Slowly, miraculously, Leo lowered the ketchup. He slid into the vinyl booth. A moment later, Beatrice, looking thoroughly bewildered, followed him. Clara wiped the syrup off the floor in 3 efficient swipes. 3 black coffees and 2 orders of chocolate chip pancakes coming up, she said to Richard, turning away before he could respond. When Clara returned with the plates, the twins were sitting in stunned silence. Richard watched Clara as if she were an alien species. He paid the $20 bill with a $100 tip, waiting until Clara returned to clear the plates. "How did you do that?" Richard asked quietly, his voice a low baritone carrying genuine desperation. "Do what?" Clara stacked the sticky plates on her arm. "Treat them like kids instead of ticking time bombs? People act how you expect them to act, Mr. Sterling. You expect them to be nightmares, so they are." Richard studied her, his eyes taking in her worn shoes, the fraying edges of her apron, and the fierce intelligence in her gaze. "What is your name?" "Clara." "Clara, how much do you make in a month here?" Clara frowned, defensive. "Enough to mind my own business." Richard reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulling out a sleek leather checkbook and a gold fountain pen. He quickly scribbled a number and tore the check out, sliding it across the wiped formica table. Clara glanced down. The number written there was more than she made in 2 years of double shifts. "That is your signing bonus," Richard said, his tone entirely serious. "I will pay you $20,000 a month, with full medical benefits, room and board, to be the nanny for Beatrice and Leo. You start tonight." Clara stared at the check. It was a lifeline. It was the end of the collection calls, the end of the suffocating panic that gripped her chest every time the rent was due. But she looked at the twins, who were glaring at her from the doorway with renewed malice, plotting their revenge. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said slowly, picking up the check, "I don't have a degree in early childhood development. I'm a waitress." "Clara," Richard replied, standing up and buttoning his jacket, "I don't need a degree. I need a warden. I'll expect you at the Greenwich estate by 6. The Sterling estate wasn't just a house. It was a modern architectural fortress of glass, steel, and cold imported marble, secluded behind wrought iron gates at the end of a winding, private road in Connecticut. When Clara pulled up in her rusted 2008 Honda Civic, the contrast between her life and this one was almost comical. She parked next to a fleet of black SUVs and took a deep breath, clutching her single duffel bag. The heavy oak door was opened by an older woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a tailored black dress and an expression of deep, mournful pity. "You must be Clara," the woman said, stepping aside. "I am Mrs. Higgins, the estate manager. Come in, though I suggest you don't unpack entirely." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Higgins," Clara said, stepping into a grand foyer that echoed with an uncomfortable emptiness. There were no family photos, no scattered toys, no signs that children lived here at all. It felt like a museum. "Why shouldn't I unpack?" Mrs. Higgins let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "The last one, Abigail, lasted 4 days. The one before that, Sarah, made it to lunch on day 2. The twins have, prepared for your arrival." Clara felt a spark of adrenaline. She had managed a diner full of rowdy drunks on St. Patrick's Day. A couple of spoiled rich kids didn't terrify her. "Lead the way." Mrs. Higgins guided Clara up a sweeping staircase to the 3rd floor, which served as the children's wing. As they walked, Clara noted the absolute silence. "Where is Mr. Sterling?" "Mr. Sterling works in the city until late, and when he is home, he occupies the West Wing. Mrs." Higgins explained, her tone strictly professional, though a hint of disapproval bled through. "He prefers not to be disturbed. His fiancée, Miss Sylvia, will be joining us for the weekend. I strongly advise you to keep the children out of her sight. She has very little patience for their eccentricities." "So the father is a ghost, and the soon-to-be stepmother hates them," Clara thought. Suddenly, the twins' behavior at the diner made a lot more sense. They weren't just spoiled, they were screaming for attention in an empty, echoing mansion. "This is your room," Mrs. Higgins said, stopping before a heavy mahogany door. "The children's rooms are across the hall. Dinner is served in the nursery at 6:30. Good luck." With a final sympathetic look, The housekeeper retreated downstairs. Clara reached for the brass doorknob. Her hand was an inch away when her waitress instincts, honed by years of catching falling trays and dodging spilled drinks, kicked in. She paused. She noticed a faint, glossy sheen on the brass, and looking down, she saw a microscopic pool of clear liquid on the dark hardwood floor directly beneath the handle. Baby oil. She also noticed a very thin, nearly invisible piece of fishing line strung low across the threshold, tethered to the leg of a heavy console table inside the room. If she had grabbed the slippery knob, lost her balance, and stepped forward, she would have tripped headfirst onto the hardwood. Clara didn't sigh. She didn't call out. She calmly took a rag from her duffel bag, wiped the knob, and stepped carefully over the wire. She left the door wide open. Beatrice. "Leo," Clara called out, her voice ringing clearly down the hallway. "Front and center. Now." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door across the hall crept open. The twins stepped out, exchanging disappointed glances. They were dressed in immaculate designer sleepwear, looking like little angels, but their eyes were sharp and calculating. "You didn't trip," Leo noted, sounding genuinely aggrieved. "I don't trip," Clara said, leaning against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "Let's get one thing straight right now. I know every trick in the book. You want to play pranks? Fine. But if you waste my time, I'm going to waste yours." Beatrice scoffed, tossing her dark hair. "You can't do anything to us. Daddy won't let you. The last nanny took away our iPads, so we threw her designer shoes in the koi pond. Daddy just bought her new ones." "I don't care about your iPads, and I don't own designer shoes," Clara said, stepping closer. She knelt down so she was at eye level with them, invading their space. "I care about respect. I am not your servant, and I am not a punchline for your boredom. I'm here to make sure you stay alive, do your homework, and eat something that isn't coated in sugar." "You're just a waitress," Leo spat. "Sylvia says waitresses are just people who weren't smart enough to get real jobs." Clara felt a familiar flash of anger at the mention of the fiancé, but she kept her face carefully blank. Sylvia sounds like someone who has never had to work a day in her life. "Now, you two are going to take down this fishing line, and you're going to wipe the floor. Then, we are going down to the kitchen." "The kitchen?" Beatrice asked, her aristocratic little nose wrinkling. "We eat in the nursery. Maria brings it to us." "Not anymore," Clara declared, standing up. "Tonight, you're learning how to make your own dinner. And if you refuse, you don't eat." The twins stared at her, horrified. Refusing to eat was a tactic they used to make nannies cry and beg. The idea that this woman would just let them go hungry was entirely outside their paradigm. "You wouldn't," Leo whispered. Clara offered a tight, unapologetic smile. "Try me." As the twins begrudgingly began untying the fishing line, Clara looked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the west wing. The house was cold, guarded, and full of secrets. She had survived the chaotic nights at the diner, but as she watched the Millionaire's children quietly dismantle their trap, Clara realized the real danger wasn't the twins. It was whatever had broken them in the first place. And Clara Jenkins was determined to find out exactly what that was. The main kitchen of the Sterling estate was a culinary cathedral. It boasted twin stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerators, a massive 8-burner Wolf range that looked like it belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant, and an expanse of Calacatta marble countertops so pristine they practically gleamed under the recessed lighting. Standing in the center of this immaculate sanctuary was Chef Laurent, a temperamental man imported from Lyon who was currently arranging a microgreen salad with a pair of silver tweezers. He froze as Clara marched in, flanked by the 2 sullen 7-year-olds. "Excuse me," Chef Laurent said, his thick accent dripping with immediate disdain. "The nursery meals are dispatched via the dumbwaiter at 6:30 sharp. The children are not permitted in my kitchen. It is a hazard." "Change of plans," Laurent, Clara said, dropping her duffel bag by the pantry door and rolling up the sleeves of her worn flannel shirt. "Cancel the nursery order. The kids are cooking for themselves tonight." Laurent's tweezers clattered against a porcelain plate. "Cooking? Mon Dieu, they will burn the house down. Mr. Sterling pays me exorbitantly to ensure their nutritional—" "Mr. Sterling just paid me exorbitantly to make sure they stop acting like feral cats," Clara interrupted, her tone leaving zero room for debate. "I need flour, water, yeast, salt, and whatever tomato sauce you have simmering over there. We're making pizza." "I do not make pizza," Laurent scoffed, looking utterly affronted. "Great, then you won't mind if we use your counter space. Take a break, chef." For a moment, Laurent looked as though he might call security, but Clara's eyes held that same unyielding, terrifying calm she had used on the twins back at the Brass Spoon Diner. Muttering darkly in French, he untied his apron, threw it over a stool, and stormed out through the swinging doors. Clara turned to Beatrice and Leo. They were standing awkwardly near the island, looking completely out of their element. In their world, food simply appeared on silver trays. The concept of creating it was entirely foreign. "Wash your hands," Clara ordered, pointing to the copper prep sink. "Use the soap, scrub for 20 seconds. "I'm not touching raw food," Beatrice declared, crossing her arms tightly over her cashmere sweater. "It has bacteria. My mother read a Goop article about it before she left." It was the first mention Clara had heard of the twins' mother. She mentally filed the information away. "Bacteria is everywhere, Bea. It's on your iPad screen, it's on your shoes, and it's definitely on that doorknob you tried to grease up. Wash your hands." Leo, perhaps sensing that a battle of wills was useless, dragged a step stool to the sink and turned on the water. Beatrice, glaring daggers at Clara's back, eventually followed suit. Clara dumped a small mountain of 00 flour onto the marble, creating a crater in the center. She poured in warm water, olive oil, and yeast. "All right, get in here. Mix it together." "With what?" Leo asked, looking around for a specialized tool. "With your hands," Clara said. The twins stared at her, as if she had asked them to stick their hands into a vat of toxic waste. Slowly, tentatively, Leo reached out and poked the wet flour mixture. It stuck to his finger. He grimaced. Beatrice was even more hesitant, but as she watched her brother begin to squish the dough, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of curiosity lit up her icy blue eyes. "Push it down. Fold it over." "It's called kneading," Clara instructed, standing back. She didn't do it for them. She let them struggle. She let the dough stick to their palms, let flour dust their designer pajamas. 10 minutes later, the pristine kitchen was a disaster zone. Flour coated the floor, the countertops, and the tips of Beatrice's nose. But for the first time since Clara had met them, the twins weren't plotting. They were working. They were arguing over who got to knead the dough, their voices losing that sharp, manipulative edge and sounding, briefly, like normal 7-year-olds. "It's too sticky," Leo complained, though he was aggressively pummeling the dough. "Add a pinch of flour," Clara said from her perch on a bar stool. "Not too much, or it'll taste like cardboard." Once the dough was resting, Clara made them chopped mozzarella. She watched them closely, noticing how they held the blunt butter knives with a clumsy, awkward grip. These children had fine motor skills honed for swiping touchscreens, not for basic survival. They had been raised by screens, distant wealth, and terrified nannies. No one had ever asked anything of them, and so they had nothing to give. When the misshapen, wildly uneven pizzas finally came out of the oven, the twins looked at them with profound suspicion. Leo's had entirely too much cheese concentrated in one corner. Beatrice's was burnt on the edges. Clara sliced them up and pushed the plates forward. "Eat." Leo took a cautious bite. He chewed slowly. Then he took another, much larger bite. "It's not terrible," he mumbled through a mouthful of crust. Beatrice picked off a piece of pepperoni, inspecting it before popping it into her mouth. "Laurent makes better food," she lied, her cheeks flushed with a strange, unfamiliar pride. "Maybe," Clara said, pouring herself a glass of water. "But Laurent didn't make this. You did." They ate in silence, the massive kitchen feeling slightly less cavernous. But the fragile peace shattered an hour later when Mrs. Higgins entered the kitchen, her face pale. "Clara," the estate manager said, her eyes widening at the flour-dusted wreckage, "Mr. Sterling just called. He is coming home early tonight, and Miss Carmichael is with him." The twins froze. The tiny bit of warmth that had blossomed in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a chilling, rigid tension. Leo dropped his pizza crust. Beatrice wiped her mouth with a napkin, her posture straightening into a stiff, terrified perfection. "Clean this up," Beatrice whispered to Clara, panic lacing her voice. If Sylvia sees this mess, if she sees us like this, she'll what? Clara asked, noting the genuine fear in the girl's eyes. She'll tell Dad we're being unruly, Leo said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. And Dad will listen to her. He always listens to her. Clara looked at the two sticky, flour-covered children. She saw the defensive walls slamming back into place, the billionaire brats returning to shield the frightened kids beneath. Go upstairs, Clara said quietly. Take a bath. Scrub the flour off. I'll handle the kitchen. As the twins bolted for the back stairs, Clara grabbed a sponge. The real test wasn't the children. The real test was about to walk through the front door. Sylvia Carmichael did not walk into a room. She held court in it. She arrived at the Greenwich estate wearing a stark white Max Mara cashmere coat draped over her shoulders, a vintage Hermès Kelly bag hooked on her arm, and the kind of sharp, angular beauty that required thousands of dollars in monthly dermatological upkeep. She was 32, ruthlessly ambitious, and possessed a voice that sounded like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. Richard Sterling trailed behind her, looking exhausted, his tie loosened, a bespoke leather briefcase hanging heavy in his hand. Clara was waiting in the foyer, dressed in a clean black long-sleeve shirt and dark jeans, having successfully scrubbed the kitchen back to its surgical perfection. Richard, darling, the driveway needs repaving, Sylvia was saying, not bothering to lower her voice. The suspension on the Bentley practically wept going over those ruts near the gate. I'll have Mrs. Higgins call the contractors on Monday, Richard sighed, handing his coat to the waiting housekeeper. He turned and finally noticed Clara. Ah, Clara, you're still here. It's only been 6 hours, Mr. Sterling. I haven't quite reached my breaking point yet, Clara replied smoothly. Sylvia stopped, her manicured hand hovering over her bag. She slowly turned her head, her gaze sweeping over Clara, from her sensible boots to her unstyled brown hair. Her eyes narrowed, calculating Clara's net worth in a fraction of a second and finding it utterly lacking. And who is this? Sylvia asked, though she directed the question to Richard, as if Clara were a piece of misplaced furniture. This is Clara Jenkins, Richard explained, rubbing his temples. The new nanny. Clara, this is my fiancée, Sylvia. The waitress? Sylvia's laugh was sharp and entirely devoid of humor. Richard, tell me you are joking. You hired a diner waitress to manage Beatrice and Leo? What's next? Sourcing our security detail from the local mall cops? She handled them, Richard said defensively, which is more than I can say for the professionals from the agency. Sylvia took a step toward Clara, the scent of expensive Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume washing over the space. Handling them for an hour over pancakes is very different from managing the Sterling household, Miss Jenkins. I am hosting a private dinner tomorrow night for several senior partners at Sequoia Capital. It is an extremely delicate negotiation for Richard's next acquisition. I expect the children to be entirely invisible, fed in their rooms, kept completely silent, and absolutely out of my way. Can you manage that? Or do I need to print out an instruction manual? Clara felt her jaw tighten. She had dealt with women like Sylvia before, the wealthy socialites who came into the diner at 3 a.m. after a charity gala, snapping their fingers for service and leaving their fake eyelashes on the tables. I can manage the children, Miss Carmichael, Clara said, her voice perfectly level. But they live here. This is their home. They won't be locked in their rooms like prisoners. Sylvia's eyes flared with sudden, venomous anger. She stepped so close, Clara could see the subtle Botox tension in her forehead. Let us get one thing incredibly clear, Clara. You are a temporary placeholder, a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage. Do not mistake your employment for authority. Keep the brats out of my sight, or you'll be back pouring bad coffee by Sunday morning. Before Clara could respond, Sylvia linked her arm through Richard's. Come, Richard, my head is pounding. Pour me a scotch. Richard cast an apologetic, helpless look over his shoulder as Sylvia led him toward the west wing. Clara stood in the foyer, her blood boiling. She suddenly understood why the twins were so destructive. They were fighting a war for their father's attention against a woman who actively despised them, and their father was too exhausted or too blind to see it. The next day was a master class in tension. The estate buzzed with caterers, florists arranging white orchids, and string quartet musicians setting up in the grand dining room. Sylvia barked orders at everyone, creating an atmosphere of sheer panic. Clara kept the twins in the third-floor library. They were unusually quiet, sitting on the velvet sofas, staring at their expensive tablets. But Clara noticed they weren't playing games. They were texting each other. Across the room, "All right, what's the play?" Clara asked, closing the book she was pretending to read. Leo jumped, hiding his tablet. "Nothing. Don't lie to me, Leo. You two have been vibrating with malicious intent for 3 hours. What are you planning for tonight's dinner party?" Beatrice looked up, her expression hardening. "None of your business. She hates us. She wants us gone. So we're going to make sure her stupid investor dinner is a disaster." She ordered a $5,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux wine for the toast. "I know the code to the wine cellar." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And? What's the grand plan? Swap it out for grape juice?" "Vinegar," Leo corrected, a wicked smirk crossing his face. "Balsamic. It's dark enough. She won't know until she takes a sip in front of the Sequoia Capital guys." It was a brilliant, highly destructive prank. It would thoroughly humiliate Sylvia, likely ruin Richard's business deal, and undoubtedly result in the twins facing severe, possibly permanent, consequences. "No," Clara said flatly. "You can't stop us," Beatrice snapped, standing up. "You're just the nanny. You're supposed to protect us." "I am protecting you," Clara fired back, her voice echoing in the cavernous library. She walked over, kneeling in front of Beatrice. "Listen to me. If you do this, Sylvia wins. Think about it. She wants to prove to your father that you are uncontrollable, monstrous children. If you ruin his business deal, you are giving her the exact ammunition she needs." Beatrice hesitated, her lower lip trembling slightly before she bit it down. "She's already winning. I heard her on the phone this morning." "Heard her say what?" Clara asked softly. Leo looked down at his shoes. "She was talking to some admissions office, a place called Institut La Rose. It's in Switzerland. She told them Dad was fully on board to send us away for the winter term." Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. Institut La Rose was known as the School of Kings, an elite, absurdly expensive boarding school in Ocean Away. Sylvia wasn't just trying to sideline the twins. She was actively orchestrating their exile. She wanted a child-free marriage and a clear path to the sterling fortune. And Richard, exhausted and manipulated, might actually agree to it if the twins kept acting out. "Did your father say he was sending you away?" Clara asked. "He doesn't have to," Beatrice said, a single tear escaping her eye, which she furiously wiped away. "He does whatever she wants. He doesn't want us either." Clara's heart broke for the two terrified children hiding behind their designer clothes and vicious pranks. They were cornered. Clara stood up, a dangerous, calculating light entering her eyes. She had survived the vicious, cutthroat politics of restaurant management, dealing with corrupt health inspectors and predatory landlords. A high society gold digger was just a different kind of predator. "Okay," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low conspiratorial whisper. "We don't touch the wine. We don't throw tantrums. Tonight, you two are going to be absolute angels. You are going to be the most polite, charming, sophisticated 7-year-olds the state of Connecticut has ever seen." The twins looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Why?" Leo demanded. "That just makes her look good." "No," Clara corrected, a slow, sharp smile spreading across her face. "It makes her look like a liar. She's been telling these investors and your father that you are uncontrollable nightmares. If you show up tonight and act like perfect little adults, her narrative falls apart. We play the long game. We expose her." Beatrice's eyes widened, the sheer tactical brilliance of the plan dawning on her. It wasn't a tantrum. It was psychological warfare. And the twins were incredibly good at psychological warfare. "What do we have to do?" Beatrice asked, her posture straightening, ready for battle. "First," Clara said, turning toward the door, "we need to get you dressed in something that doesn't look like you're about to attend a funeral. And second, I need to have a little chat with Chef Laurent about tonight's menu. I think Miss Carmichael might have a sudden, terrible allergic reaction to the amuse-bouche." The Millionaire's twins and the diner waitress shared a look of pure, unadulterated solidarity. The real war for the Sterling estate had just begun. The Sterling dining room was a masterclass in intimidating opulence. The mahogany table, long enough to seat 20, gleamed under the light of a tiered baccarat crystal chandelier. At the head of the table sat Harrison Caldwell, a notoriously ruthless senior partner at Sequoia Capital, flanked by two of his equally formidable associates. Sylvia held court at the opposite end, wearing a striking emerald green silk gown, radiating the manufactured warmth of a seasoned socialite. Richard sat quietly to Harrison's right, the dark circles under his eyes, a stark contrast to his tailored tuxedo. The first course, a delicate lobster consommé, had just been cleared when the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. Sylvia braced herself. Her grip on her crystal wine glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. She had warned Harrison that Richard's children were going through a deeply troubled phase and preemptively apologized for any screaming, thrown objects, or broken glass that might interrupt their evening. She was fully expecting the twins to burst in, smeared in dirt, armed with water guns, or perhaps dragging a screaming staff member behind them. Instead, Beatrice and Leo walked in with the synchronized grace of a royal procession. Leo wore a perfectly tailored navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle tartan bow tie. His hair, usually a wild mop, was neatly parted. Beside him, Beatrice wore a modest, beautifully cut midnight blue velvet dress, her dark hair pulled back into a flawless French braid tied with a satin ribbon. There was no shouting. There was no running. "Good evening, Father." "Miss Carmichael," Leo said, his voice carrying the polite, modulated cadence of a miniature diplomat. He turned to the guests, offering a sharp, respectful nod. "We apologize for the interruption. We simply wanted to bid you all a good night before we retired to our studies." The dining room descended into a stunned, absolute silence. Sylvia's jaw physically dropped. She stared at the twins as if they had just sprouted second heads. Richard blinked, looking rapidly between his children and his fiancée, utter confusion washing over his exhausted features. Harrison Caldwell, however, let out a booming, delighted laugh. "Well, Richard, you kept these two hidden. Troubled phase, Sylvia? They look like they should be on the brochure for Yale." "Good evening, sir," Beatrice said, offering Harrison a flawless curtsy that Clara had drilled into her for 45 minutes in the upstairs hallway. "Are you the gentleman from Sequoia Capital? Our father speaks very highly of your market analysis." Harrison looked as though someone had just handed him the winning lottery numbers. He beamed, leaning forward. "I am indeed, young lady. And what might your name be?" "Beatrice." "And this is my brother, Leo," she replied, her smile radiant and entirely devoid of the malice she usually reserved for adults. "We hope your negotiations are fruitful. Father has been working terribly hard on the acquisition." They are usually in bed by now," Sylvia stammered, her voice shrill, the carefully curated Ice Queen facade cracking spectacularly. She shot a venomous glare toward the hallway, where Clara was standing just out of sight, leaning casually against the wainscoting. "Nonsense," Harrison dismissed Sylvia with a wave of his hand. "It is a pleasure to meet children with such exquisite manners. My own grandsons behave like feral raccoons. Come here, both of you. Do you like chess?" For the next 20 minutes, the Millionaire's twins did not throw a single tantrum. They did not spill a drop of water. Under Clara's strict, behind-the-scenes coaching, they engaged the Sequoia Capital partners in light, polite conversation about their geography tutors and their recent and entirely fabricated interest in classical violin. They were charming, articulate, and completely enchanting. Sylvia looked physically ill. Her entire narrative, the narrative she had been spinning to Richard for 6 months to justify sending them away, was disintegrating in front of a billionaire investor. "I must say," Richard Harrison said, taking a sip of his wine, "with a family like this anchoring you, I feel incredibly secure about this merger. A man who can raise children with this much discipline and grace is a man I trust with my capital. I heard a rumor you were looking into boarding schools in Switzerland. I say absolutely not. Keep them close. Family is your foundation." Richard looked at his children, a strange, long-forgotten emotion surfacing in his eyes. Pride. "Thank you, Harrison." Yes. They are quite remarkable." "All right, children, it is past your bedtime," Sylvia snapped, unable to tolerate another second of it. Her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course, Miss Carmichael," Leo said dutifully. "Good night, Father. Good night, gentlemen." As the twins turned to leave, the kitchen doors opened, and Chef Laurent stepped out, carrying a silver tray holding the amuse-bouche. It was a delicate crostini topped with whipped ricotta and a generous shaving of rare white truffles. Clara watched from the shadows as the plates were set down. This was the second part of the plan. Sylvia, furious and desperate to regain control of the table, immediately picked up her crostini and took a large bite. As I was saying, Harrison, the logistics of the merger. She stopped. Richard was staring at her, his face completely pale. Sylvia, Richard said, his voice tight with sudden panic. Spit that out. Laurent, what is on that plate? White truffles, monsieur, Laurent replied proudly. Flown in from Alba this afternoon. Richard jumped up, knocking his chair back. Sylvia, you told me you were deathly allergic to white truffles. Where is your EpiPen? Someone call an ambulance. The table erupted into chaos. Harrison looked alarmed, but Sylvia simply froze, a piece of the crostini still in her hand. She wasn't coughing. Her throat wasn't closing. She wasn't turning red. Aye, Sylvia stammered, her eyes darting around the room as everyone stared at her perfectly clear, uninflamed skin. 6 months ago, Richard had planned a lavish trip to Italy for himself, Sylvia, and the twins to try and bond as a family. Sylvia had miraculously developed a lethal airborne allergy to white truffles 2 days before the trip, forcing Richard to cancel the family vacation and take her to street. Bart's alone instead. Clara stepped fully into the light of the dining room, holding a silver water pitcher. Oh, my deepest apologies, Miss Carmichael, Clara said, her voice dripping with fake horror. When you told me earlier to make sure the menu was absolutely perfect for Mr. Caldwell, I must have forgotten to relay your severe medical condition to the chef. Are you all right? Should I perform the Heimlich? Sylvia glared at Clara with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated. She had been caught in a massive, manipulative lie in front of her fiancé and his most important investors. It seems my doctor was mistaken. Sylvia managed to choke out, her face burning an ugly, mottled red. Richard slowly sat back down, his eyes locked on Sylvia. The exhaustion in his face was suddenly replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. He wasn't a billionaire because he was stupid. He was just a grieving man who had let himself be blinded. The blindfold was rapidly slipping. I see, Richard said quietly. How fortunate for us all. The rest of the dinner was a graveyard. Harrison Caldwell signed the preliminary term sheet, shook Richard's hand, and left by 10 o'clock. As soon as the front doors clicked shut, Sylvia spun on her heels, marching straight toward the grand staircase. Clara was waiting for her at the bottom step. You, Sylvia hissed, her voice a venomous whisper as she invaded Clara's personal space. The scent of Baccarat Rouge was overwhelming. You think you are so incredibly clever, don't you, you little gutter rat? I don't know what you mean, Miss Carmichael, Clara replied, not stepping back an inch. She had faced down bikers wielding broken beer bottles. A furious socialite in a silk gown did not intimidate her. I thought the dinner was a spectacular success, Mr. Sterling secured his investment. Do not play games with me, Sylvia snarled, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing into Clara's collarbone. I know exactly what you did tonight. You weaponized those little monsters against me. I didn't weaponize anyone, Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. She slapped Sylvia's hand away with a swift, dismissive motion. I just dressed them nicely and told them to say please and thank you. If a couple of 7-year-olds acting polite completely unravels your life, maybe your life is built on a very fragile foundation. Sylvia's eyes narrowed into slits. You have no idea what you have walked into, Clara. Richard is mine. This house is mine. Those children are a liability, and by the end of the month, they will be freezing in a dormitory in the Swiss Alps. And you? You'll be back wiping grease off vinyl booths with a black mark on your non-existent resume. We'll see about that, Clara said calmly. Have a good night, Sylvia. Try not to eat any imaginary peanuts before bed. Clara turned her back on the furious woman and walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor. When she entered the nursery, the twins were sitting on the floor in their pajamas, their adrenaline crashing. They looked up at Clara with wide, expectant eyes. Did it work? Leo whispered. Flawlessly, Clara said, sitting cross-legged on the plush rug next to them. Your father saw exactly who she is tonight, and more importantly, he saw who you are. I am so proud of you both. Beatrice looked down at her hands, her lower lip trembling. The hardened, cynical shell she wore was cracking. Dad looked at us like he actually liked us, she whispered, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. He hasn't looked at us like that since before the accident. Clara gently placed a hand on Beatrice's shoulder. Since your mother? Leo nodded, pulling his knees to his chest. Mom died 3 years ago. Car crash on the Merritt Parkway. Dad broke after that. He just stopped being here. He hired nannies, he worked all night, and then Sylvia showed up. She was his assistant. She started packing up all of Mom's things. If we tried to stop her, she told Dad we were throwing tantrums and breaking things. She threw away Mom's favorite painting, Beatrice sobbed quietly. So I took her favorite Chanel bag and threw it in the koi pond, and then Dad called me a monster. The entire tragic puzzle finally snapped together in Clara's mind. The twins weren't born sociopaths. They were drowning in unaddressed grief, abandoned by a father who couldn't cope, and actively terrorized by a woman who wanted to erase their mother's memory to secure her own position. Their tantrums were desperate screams for help. Listen to me, Clara said, pulling both children into a firm, grounding hug. They stiffened at first, unaccustomed to genuine, unconditional affection before melting into her arms, crying softly into her flannel shirt. You are not monsters. You are kids who lost your mom, and you've been fighting a war all by yourselves. But you're not by yourselves anymore. I'm here, and I do not lose. The next morning, the Sterling estate felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. Richard had left for the city before dawn, leaving Clara, the twins, and Sylvia alone in the massive house. Clara was in the kitchen pouring orange juice when Mrs. Higgins rushed in, her usually stoic face flushed with panic. Clara, the estate manager gasped. You need to come to the foyer. Now. Clara set the pitcher down and walked to the front of the house. Sylvia was standing by the grand front doors, fully dressed in a tailored Prada suit, holding her phone. 2 Greenwich police officers were standing awkwardly on the marble floor. Officers, there she is, Sylvia said, pointing a sharp, perfectly polished fingernail at Clara, the new nanny. I noticed my diamond tennis bracelet, a gift from my fiancé, valued at $45,000, was missing from my vanity this morning. She is the only new element in this house, and considering her financial background, well, the math is quite simple. Sylvia smiled, a cold, triumphant smirk. I demand that her room and her bags be searched immediately. The Greenwich police officers shifted uncomfortably in the grand foyer. They were accustomed to domestic disputes, but dealing with the furious fiancé of a billionaire in a house filled with priceless art was a delicate matter. Sylvia stood with her arms crossed, her Prada suit a sharp contrast to Clara's faded denim. Ma'am, we can't just tear apart an employee's room without probable cause. The older officer, a heavily built man named Officer Davis, explained patiently. Consent? Sylvia scoffed, her voice echoing off the marble floors. She is a hired hand. I am the lady of this house, and I am telling you she stole my jewelry. If you do not march up those stairs right now, I will have the police commissioner on the phone. Clara watched Sylvia's performance with detached amusement. Sylvia had realized her grip on Richard was slipping, and this was her scorched earth tactic. Remove the nanny, isolate the children, and regain control. It's fine, Officer Davis, Clara said, her voice steady and entirely devoid of panic. You have my full consent to search my room and my belongings. 3rd floor, first door on the left. The duffel bag is at the foot of the bed. Sylvia's triumphant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second at Clara's utter lack of fear, but she quickly recovered. You see, she thinks she's hidden it well. Tear the room apart. 10 agonizing minutes passed in total silence. Sylvia checked her diamond-encrusted Rolex, tapping her stiletto impatiently. Clara simply leaned against the heavy oak doorway, calculating her next move. Footsteps echoed on the landing. Officer Davis descended the stairs, holding a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside, glittering under the massive chandelier, was a heavy diamond tennis bracelet. Sylvia let out a loud theatrical gasp. My bracelet! Oh, thank goodness! You see, officers? I told you. The diner waitress couldn't resist. Arrest her immediately. Officer Davis looked at Clara, his expression hardening. Miss Jenkins, we found this tucked inside a pair of boots at the bottom of your duffel bag. I'm afraid I have to ask you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. Clara didn't move. She didn't cry, and she didn't beg. She simply looked up at the top of the stairs. Wait, a small, sharp voice commanded. Everyone in the foyer froze. Standing on the landing, looking down at the scene like tiny monarchs, were Beatrice and Leo. Leo was holding his high-end iPad Pro. The children shouldn't see this, Sylvia snapped, panic lacing her voice. Mrs. Higgins, take them to the nursery. We aren't going anywhere, Beatrice said, walking down the stairs with a regal calmness that mirrored Clara's. Officer, before you arrest our nanny, you need to see what my brother has. Leo reached the bottom step and held out the iPad to Officer Davis. Press play. Sylvia's face drained of color. What is this? Richard strictly forbids recording devices in the private quarters. Dad forbids you from putting cameras in our rooms, Leo corrected, his icy blue eyes locking onto Sylvia. We set up a motion-activated recording app last night and hid it on top of the bookshelf in Clara's room. We wanted to see if she was going to snoop through our things. Clara raised an eyebrow. The little terrors had bugged her room. Under normal circumstances, she would have disciplined them. Today, she wanted to buy them a pony. Officer Davis pressed play. The volume was turned all the way up. The screen showed the dark interior of Clara's bedroom. The timestamp in the corner read 5:42 a.m. The door creaked open. A figure slipped into the room, Sylvia, still wearing her silk robe. The camera clearly captured her face as she tiptoed to Clara's duffel bag, pulled the diamond bracelet from her pocket, and shoved it deep into one of Clara's worn leather boots. She then hurried out. The foyer fell into a vacuum of silence. Well, Clara said, that's a plot twist. Sylvia stumbled backward. That is doctored. They edited the video to frame me. Ma'am, this is a continuous, time-stamped video file, Officer Davis said, dropping his polite deference. Filing a false police report is a crime. Attempting to frame an innocent person for grand larceny is a severe felony. I'm going to need you to come down to the station. You cannot arrest me. Sylvia shrieked, her mask entirely shattered. I am Sylvia Carmichael. Not anymore. The heavy front door swung open. Richard Sterling stood on the threshold, breathing heavily. He had driven like a madman from Manhattan after Mrs. Higgins secretly called him. He had walked in just in time to hear the audio and witness Sylvia's meltdown. Richard, Sylvia gasped. They are setting me up. Richard stepped to the side, letting her stumble past him. He looked at the officers, the iPad, and finally at Clara. I heard everything, Richard said, his voice a low rumble. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by uncompromising fury. You tried to send my children away. You lied about your allergies to manipulate me. And now you are trying to send an innocent woman to prison. We are done. Sylvia screamed as the second officer firmly grabbed her arm. She thrashed and sobbed as she was escorted out the front doors and into the back of a police cruiser. When the flashing lights disappeared, Richard closed the heavy oak doors. He slowly turned to look at Beatrice and Leo. They expected him to yell about the hidden camera. Instead, the billionaire CEO dropped to his knees on the marble floor, buried his face in his hands, and wept. I am so sorry, Richard choked out. I was drowning after your mother died, and I left you two alone in the dark. I let a monster into our home. Beatrice and Leo hesitated, looking up at Clara. She gave them a gentle nod. Slowly, the twins walked over and wrapped their arms around their father, the three of them finally grieving together. Clara watched from the doorway with a soft smile. She quietly picked up her duffel bag. Her job here was done. The fortress had been breached. Clara, wait. Richard stood up, his eyes red but clear. Where are you going? Back to the Brass Spoon, Clara replied simply. You don't need a warden anymore, Mr. Sterling. You just need to be a dad. No, Beatrice cried. You can't leave. Who is going to tell me when I'm being a brat? Leo added in a panic. Richard stepped forward. I don't want a warden for them, Clara, and I don't want a nanny. I want someone who protects my family when I'm too blind to do it myself. Stay, not as an employee, as family. Clara let the duffel bag slide off her shoulder. It hit the floor with a soft thud. All right, Clara said, offering a wicked grin, but I make the rules. And tomorrow, we are burning those ridiculous velvet dresses and going to a baseball game. The twins cheered, a loud, joyful noise that finally shattered the silence of the Sterling estate for good. The transformation of the Sterling household didn't happen overnight, but the ice had definitively broken. Clara Jenkins never returned to the graveyard shift at the Brass Spoon Diner. Instead, She traded her waitress apron for a permanent place in the Greenwich estate, officially serving as the estate manager, but unofficially acting as the glue that held the family together. Under her sharp, no-nonsense guidance, Beatrice and Leo flourished, channeling their brilliant, manipulative energy into debate clubs and coding camps rather than tormenting the staff. Richard, finally awake from his years of grief, scaled back his hours at the firm, learning to prioritize school plays over board meetings. The massive, cold mansion filled with laughter, burned pizza crusts, and genuine warmth. Sylvia's name became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Against all odds, the waitress who refused to be intimidated had done the impossible. She gave the Millionaire's twins their father back.